tell people, look, you're investing in yourself. You're investing to get over this crunch period of time to keep your kids' life stable financially, and then that will stop. That's not going to be a forever thing. So there's a lot of details that go into that conversation about, structuring.
Hi, I'm Kate Sharp, host of the podcast Divorce on Planet Earth, Real World Advice for Well-Intentioned Humans. When it comes to dividing finances in divorce, most people feel scared and overwhelmed. After all, when you got married, you didn't imagine having to have this conversation. You didn't imagine having to talk about dividing your assets and think about how you were each going to pay your expenses, or whether there was going to be child support or alimony with the person that you were going to be sharing your life with. And suddenly your spouse begins to feel like an adversary. But it doesn't have to be that way. At least it doesn't have to be that bad. Most people don't know that there are financial experts who are trained to shepherd couples through the divorce process in ways that can calm anxiety, can lower conflict, can clarify confusing issues. Today, we're joined by Debora May. Debbie is a certified public accountant, a certified financial planner, and a certified divorce financial planner. She's a real leader and an innovator, and she's left an indelible mark on the professional divorce community in the DC area. Welcome, Debbie.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. I'm really excited to have you here because I know that what you do is really important. You know that divorce is mainly an emotional process. Before we drill down into the specifics of what you offer, you could talk a little bit about that, your experience of the emotional aspect of your role.
Absolutely. I would say, first of all, that this is a very human experience for, it's people like you and I that can be going through a divorce, and people need to have a structure. They need to have someone to talk to as a sounding board. It's a very emotional process in terms of trying to figure that out for yourself down the road. And so I think what we bring to the table is some structure so that people can be thinking forward and how to create scenarios for themselves so that they can see their life financially down the road, whether what's their worst case, their best case, their safety nets. And I really look at this as a partnering with a client, that you can really help somebody plan for their life and really listen to them. So there's a lot of numbers that go on when people are trying to figure this out, but they also need to really think through the pros and cons of what they're considering. So it's scary for a million reasons for people, and there's no concrete answers for the future, but there's certainly a way to think about things in terms of the numbers. And I think that's what we bring to the table.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I know about you is you make sure your clients are informed, but you don't tell them what to do.
Absolutely not. I've been doing this for decades now, that you're always going to be amazed at how creative people can be and how thoughtful they can be about things. And you can listen and you can help them understand what you see in terms of pros and cons, but it's their life. At the end of the day, it's their life. And what we want to do is empower them, think through it, give them a chance to process information, and just accept the fact that, life is life. And even though you feel like you would have done it one way, it doesn't necessarily mean they're choosing the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. And I guess everything has a pro and a con, right?
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything in life. I've decided that that's very true.
Yeah. I think that's right. I do want to ask you, though, given that your clients, my clients, people who are going through this major life transition that, represents an upheaval in almost every area of their lives, financial issues they often represent more than the numbers. Letting go of things can feel very frightening. And so people may have very understandable feelings about these financial decisions, but they're irrational. So
can you just say a little bit about how you help people to move from that position into a position of considering things that are more realistic?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the way to do that, and this happens with everyone, is can you imagine it's pretty hard to say, okay, my net worth is all of these numbers, and now I'm going to be half, or I'm giving up a retirement account that I very much felt attached to, whatever it might be. But I think if you start creating some hypotheticals and some scenarios of what this will look like going forward, and explaining to them the tax consequences, explaining to them, how they're going to look in the future. You might be doing retirement projections and say, look, this is going to be okay, and project for them down the road. That to me is the most empowering thing you can do for people, is to put it concretely down on paper and let the scenarios evolve as they see it for their future. And then they can start to see and have control over what decisions they're making. And they become more rational. They just naturally will become more rational. But I will, and I know I probably already said this, Kate, but one thing I've really learned is to give people a little bit of time to process. They can pop into your office, you've got all these calculations, and you go bam, 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 and like you expect them to say, okay, that sounds good, I'm going to make a decision. But I've learned to let people sleep on it, process it for a bit, come back, and we go over it again. And I just look at it as like, two end posts, and you start coming more and more and more to the middle, but it takes a little bit of time.
Really, what you do that really, I think, distinguishes you and others of your ilk from your average financial professional is that you listen first. Like, you don't start in until you have a sense that people feel understood by you.
No, I think that's absolutely right, Kate. And my analogy would be that we have checklists galore. Give me this statement, give me information about your life insurance, your whatever it might be, this long checklist. But what about their goals and objectives first? I mean, that's something that we're really trained to do as a certified financial planner, that we definitely need to ground ourselves into what are their goals, what are their objectives, what are their fears, what are their concerns, and really understand it. Getting the papers, I mean, for any of us that are CPAs and certified financial planners and so forth, we understand the numbers, but sometimes we skip over that part. You're absolutely right, and not understand where are they trying to go.
I've been in rooms where you are listening to a couple fight over retirement. Somebody wants to keep it, somebody wants a part of it. And rather than coming in right away with suggestions, you say, well, it sounds like you're both concerned about security in the future. And that really diffuses things.
Yeah, I think absolutely. The interests and needs and concerns that people have is, if you can elicit that from them and really start to understand it, and it doesn't happen in 5 minutes. People need to get comfortable, and they need to feel like they can talk.
Maybe you could talk now about the roles that you can play in helping folks move through the financial aspects of their divorce, and how you can help.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in terms of roles that we play, it can be any number of them. One, it can be that a client just comes in and they're perhaps exploring a divorce. It's just them individually, and they want to know, if I move forward with this, what am I going to look like financially? So we will sit down and handle that situation for them individually. Can also have a situation where the couple is coming in together, and they want me to be neutral, and they want me to sort of help them jointly figure out what their financial picture looks like, and what different options going forward, if they make decisions financially, would look like for them, perhaps their family, their kids. It can also be that the attorney is really using us. So I've had situations where both attorneys will ask me to step in, sort of in a mediator role, where I'm trying to help them with an issue that they can't seem to get to the finish line on. So I'm looking at it neutrally and trying to assist them figuring out what it means financially. Sometimes we're trying to figure out where are the differences from them financially, or if I can have some ideas to help them settle. And then, of course, there is more the traditional situation where somebody might be more in a litigation type model, where they're asking us to actually advocate for them, sit down and go over what could be their best position for them from a negotiation standpoint.
I think people often feel very overwhelmed when they come to the point of having to discuss the division of finances.
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 parts to this process. I usually like to create the structure so that people can understand the information before we start answering questions. So one is, let's get a handle on all the assets. And traditionally, it's going to be information about a house, the bank accounts, some investment accounts, some retirement accounts. Perhaps they have some children's accounts, life insurance. That's the sort of the norm that most people, they might have some liabilities, some mortgage, a car loan. So we go through that, and so that they can imagine what I call sort of how are these assets going to be divided and how are we going to think about them. And sometimes, you can imagine, like, you typically aren't just ripping the page down in half. Somebody wants to keep the house, somebody wants to keep the retirement, and we have to figure out pros and cons, tax consequences, liquidity, valuation issues, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part, which I would say is usually the most scary for people, you alluded to, Kate, is cash flow. So now we're going to have 2 households, and we're going to have more expenses as a result. So we need to look at a budget form. We have very, very detailed budget forms that are not necessarily what somebody would fill out for court, but it's literally a financial planning budget form that helps them think of every single thing they may have in their life, trying to be, really thoughtful about their lifestyle from the past, their new life, if you will, the new expenses. Like I said, predominantly it's household expenses. And then we look at resources. And that's what I call it, is resources is what's coming into the family. I mean, when we're trying to be realistic, we have to be able to say, okay, well, how are we going to support this? If this is my budget, my normal expenses, is that going to work? What am I going to have? And what's the income coming in from working? Perhaps there's gifts. And then we might be talking about support. Like, maybe there's going to be some spousal support, child support. And we look at it just on paper, just say, okay, here's what it is. Here's the taxes that would have to be paid. And is this going to cover your expenses? And if it doesn't, then we have to think about that. What do we do? I will tell you that even when I'm working with just one party, I'm always mindful of the other party. It's not going to help to say, okay, this is what you want to ask for. This is what you should get. This is what we think is fair. If it doesn't work, the other side has to be able to pay and has to be able to live. So we're trying to be very thoughtful about, even in like I said, when we're just working with one of them, is this going to be a realistic way to go? And then, the third part is really just looking at, well, what can go wrong with this picture, right? What if I get sick? What if I lose my job? What if they lose their job? What if I become, disabled? What am I going to look like when I'm not working anymore and I'm retiring? And this is especially what comes up when I'm dealing with older people that are getting divorced in their 50s and early 60s. They're not going to be working necessarily for that much longer. So we're trying to do projections and think around that next stage of life.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and I mean, the next phase might not be unforeseen disaster. I mean, it may also be, I might want to cut back at work. I might want to go back to school. And you can help people run various scenarios, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, one thing, the financial, I think we all would agree, the financial piece of a divorce is huge. You have the legal process, you have the emotional process of going through it, but then the rest of it's financial. And the way I frame it is, let's structure your life. So here's where you're starting. Then you might have a phase that you're going back to school, to use your example. And you would think that you would make this amount of monies. Here's your next phase. Kids are grown now and they're out of the household. They're done with college. There's another phase, and then retirement. So they can think about it in those blocks. It's not just, okay, here's the support I'm going to have, end of the discussion. It really makes a difference to structure it, because it helps you move the assets around too. Some people need to spend more money in the beginning. There's not enough support. Kids got a couple more years before they go to college. You need to go back to school. So you might be spending some of your assets. And that's okay, because it's an investment. I tell people, look, you're investing in yourself. You're investing to get over this crunch period of time to keep your kids life stable financially, and then that will stop. That's not going to be a forever thing. So there's a lot of details that go into that conversation about, structuring.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people get anxious, different parts of the process, depending on what their concerns are. But I have had the experience that actually doing a budget is very overwhelming, scary, or just unappealing to a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the most tedious part of this, but I tell people you kind of must do this once. It's not going to be exact. It's not going to be right.
Yeah.
It's going to be a benchmark for you. And, I help people. We sit with people all the time. We do hundreds of these a year, and I have staff that do this. And I'll ask questions. This looks high. This looks low. I say, just put a question mark. This is always a work in process.
Yeah.
Just estimate.
So, with budgets, like with other parts of the process, if somebody feels it's hard or that makes them anxious, you're there to really be next to them and hold their hand if they need it. That's one of your jobs, right?
Oh, absolutely. And we will walk through it together and come up with something together. And if it's important, the certain things are more important than other things. There's discretionary expenses, there's fixed expenses, there's health expenses, and we will help them figure that out. Absolutely. And I think it's extremely important, just because when they're making decisions about support or their assets, what are they going to compare it to? And yeah, it may not work. It may not, there may be a negative in terms of, but it then helps you go back to looking at the game plan again and saying, okay, I could cut here, I could cut there, because budgets will change over time as well.
So when you say there may be a negative, you mean that there just isn't enough money coming in.
Right. I should say a deficit.
Yeah, deficit. But that's the other thing about budgets that I think is special about the way you do things. People may have things in their budgets that feel disproportionately expensive when you consider the household income, like, for example, an expensive country club membership or a boat. But it's not your job to judge that, right? It's just your job to point out the implications of various things and let them make their decision.
Absolutely. I mean, again, from having done this for decades, when it comes to spending, I'm always amazed. Some people spend a lot of money on what we might consider vacations or eating out, or how much they spend on clothes. And, you might react internally, but it doesn't make any difference. I mean, people spend money very, very differently on the discretionary side. And it doesn't matter. Like you said, it matters is being able to guide someone of, is this affordable? Or is this something that's going to change? This is only for a couple of years, whatever it is.
You haven't mentioned estate planning, but I think that's also something that you can help with. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I could make a very long list of things. But yeah, I mean, we talk about insurance, life insurance, health insurance, long-term care insurance, estate planning. I always ask about estate plannings because people typically would have their wills already done. But of course, they're going to have to redo them. And then they're going to be alone. So we talk about all the types of differences that there might be with estate planning, that as a single person versus a couple. And you might have trusts that were set up for the kids. And it might be important to talk about, are you going to want to, do this in coordination with your spouse or ex-spouse or not? So, yeah.
I mean, one of the things I really like about what you're saying is that if a couple didn't know that a person like you existed, they might be having this conversation only with their lawyers. And the law doesn't care about a lot of things, like how you're going to pay for your kids' college education. You don't need to have that in a divorce agreement, but you're going to bring it up and ask them if they're interested in talking about it, because life is life, and the law is another thing, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, the law is only going to deal with minor children. Depending on what state you're in, that's defined. So anything beyond that, they're adults and they're launched, and you're not obligated. But we all know that that's not true. There is college, and there is helping children, adult children, cell phone plans. I mean, there's a lot of things that go on past that. Maybe even maybe even health insurance to age 26.
Right.
Maybe you're talking about even the kids that are older. and you're wanting to help with a wedding, or you're wondering, how are we going to help our adult kids with their children? So there's a lot of, I'm going to call it co-parenting. From one level, we can all think about the interactions that might occur, but it's also financial. And a lot of people do want to have those conversations and not feel like one person is doing it and one person isn't, or really very much getting the children involved financially as a result.
People want something that feels fair. In other words, that the responsibility for educating the kids or doesn't fall to one of them, and that they don't have to then enlist their kids in trying to extract something from them later, from the other parent later or something like that. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
No, absolutely. And I have a case right now where we're being very mindful of both parties having enough resources to pay for the children's expenses, the extraordinary, the extracurriculars, the college. One person doesn't want that just one person has the money to pay. You can say, yeah, I want you to pay 100%. Well, you can say that, but maybe how does that feel?
How does it feel to the person paying 100%? But also, how does it feel to the parent if they're not contributing at all?
Exactly.
And that's
what's the right, and what's the reaction of the children, and what's the interaction? Because a lot of times people do want to interact with their children financially to be able to take them out to dinner, to take them on a vacation. And so that goes on, obviously, beyond the minor children age as well.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. I think if you have a kid, outside of high school, that adolescence goes on until about 35 in our culture. I think it's
right. Absolutely.
So we talked a little bit briefly about the law and what this conversation might look like, for example, in litigation or a settlement negotiation where the attorneys are handling all the finances. But I certainly, as a mental health professional serving as a divorce coach or a mediator, know that I'm going to get questions that are outside of my wheelhouse that are better addressed by an attorney. So I imagine you do too.
Oh, absolutely. Quite a bit. And I've learned to tell people that obviously I'm not an attorney. I'm not giving legal advice. I have experiences, and I can tell you some experiences that I've had, but you need to have a consult. You need to have an attorney. And a lot of times people are kind of afraid to have an attorney or go to an attorney. There's a fear of heating the whole situation up. If there's an attorney involved, the cost perhaps, fear of court, fear of timelines, whatever it might be. So they may not engage an attorney right away. So if they come to someone like myself, I'm going to advise them that they should at least get a consult with an attorney very early on, because I could tell you some war stories there where people start agreeing to things at the kitchen table or just in their own mind what they think is fair. And then they consult with an attorney much later and find out that the legalities or what they might have been entitled to is much different, and they want to backpedal. And that's very challenging to do when you've already, quote unquote, agreed to something. So I think I tell people, get in a consult early, understand your legal rights, what's possible for you. And then you don't have to stay engaged with that attorney until maybe it's time to actually write the agreement. And you're going to want the attorney to make sure the agreement is solid in terms of, obviously legally, and that you haven't missed anything.
Yeah, that makes good sense. So I imagine a lot of our listeners are saying, well, this sounds great. I want this. How do I find a Debbie May or someone like her? What credentials do you think people should look for?
Well, I think there's two primary credentials that would have a lot of this background financially, which would be a CPA that's going to understand, numbers in general, certainly maybe understand taxes, and a certified financial planner who's going to have the ability to talk about planning for the future, perhaps projections, perhaps investment returns, things of that nature. You will also find that there's the Certified Divorce Financial Analyst designation, CDFA, but I would say that that's not, if somebody only has that credential, that would not be my recommendation. Sometimes it's marketing to just establish a niche for divorced people, but I think it's valuable as an add-on. It certainly has some value that way. And in terms of finding us, there's obviously Google, but there is the IACP, the International Academy of collaborative practitioners, which I think does list a lot of team members. It's not just going to be attorneys, but financial people, mental health people that are working in the divorce arena, because even with the various designations, you need somebody that is experienced working with divorcing couples. I just think that that's an added specialty, whether it's the tax ramifications or just how to think about this for the divorcing couple for the future. So I just think the experience is also necessary. So that would be a site I would look at.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly know couples who have gone to their accountants because that makes sense to them. But it's not really helpful because their accountant probably doesn't understand some things that are important to understand or to know that are possible in divorce that wouldn't necessarily be possible at other times.
No, I would agree 100%. And if they were to do that, I would say that they should have them coordinate whatever work or whatever's happening with their accountant or the financial planner with the attorney. I mean, to me, that would be key, because it's not going to be helpful to run projections that are just not going to work or not going to have been thoughtful about what could happen in a divorce situation.
Yeah, maybe you can give the listeners just an idea of one or two of the kinds of things that you're talking about that are crucial to know, but not widely known about what's possible in divorce financially.
Yeah, I would say I'm going to say three things. One regarding the house. If it gets retitled, they say, okay, why don't you just take title of the house? They may not understand that may cause a big capital gain down the road if one person has title and tries to sell the house and doesn't realize that there's a capital gain implication. Mm-hmm. Two, it could be about retirement, that they don't understand that when you're dividing retirement, it needs to be done by an order. It needs to roll over into another retirement account, usually an IRA, or that there's an ability to take some money out without a penalty. And that's another
really
area
important. Actually, I just want to put a pin in that one or underline that one, because there would normally be a tax penalty if you're taking money out of a retirement account. So that's crucial information. People probably wouldn't do it if they thought that they were going to have a major tax implication.
No, absolutely. And there's ways to transfer retirement to each other. It doesn't even have to go one direction. And sometimes we'll do that. So both of them could take some money out without a penalty. So there's a lot of planning with retirement that people may not be thinking about. Thirdly, I would say is just income tax deductions, that people don't understand how they can, what their status is going to be in terms of, am I going to be head of household? Do I have to file married? Who's going to claim the kids? Who's going to get the various credits? Who can take various deductions? There's actually lots and lots of, IRS rules about these things and things that you can do in a negotiation and in an agreement. Certain things have to be in an agreement to work. So it is a specialty in many regards, but those are the three common things that I see that people can just really overlook.
That's so important for people to know. Debbie, at what point in in the continuum of thinking about divorce versus getting into a process, at what point do you recommend that people make contact with a person like you, with a financial professional with expertise in this area?
The earlier, the better.
Yeah.
I think, right away, I do have people that come to me that are, like I mentioned earlier, that are just considering what will I look like financially if I go through a process. And so I think the sooner you do that, the better. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason might be just time to think through scenarios, time to think through your next steps. Second might be that you don't have all the paperwork. You don't have all the documents. You don't know some of the information. And so is there a mechanism that you could be trying to get this information? And the financial person can certainly help you think through that or how to estimate that. And I think probably, the other reason would be that before you start discussing things with your spouse, to-be ex-spouse, that you're more empowered with the information, that you know what to say, the right things to consider.
I've had Margie Hoffberg, who I know you know, who's a wonderful mortgage broker who works with a lot of couples who are going through separation and divorce. And she said the same thing. Time to reach out isn't at the moment that you're looking to buy a house. It's much, much earlier in the process, because it turns out that the stuff that people are most anxious about is, that they don't want to talk about, is the kind of thing that they get a lot of relief from by talking about it. In other words, having information early really does diffuse anxiety. And I think that's a big part of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Margie's she's been in the business a long, long time in the divorce arena, which there's a lot of rules about underwriting, what needs to be in an agreement, what counts as income, how do you qualify. And so you really need to get your ducks in a row early on to do it.
That's an area of overlap. You also know, for example, how to structure a settlement if someone is trying to qualify for a mortgage. That there are really important things to know that someone like you would know that another financial professional who didn't have expertise in this area really wouldn't know, and somebody could get in a big jam.
Right. No, absolutely. And that's the experience part of it, is understanding the ramifications of all of these financial decisions as it relates to divorce. And as I mentioned right off the bat, the house is usually the biggest one. Somebody normally wants to stay in the house. They want to delay the sale. They want to take over the mortgage. Yeah. So we coordinate. I mean, the financial person also knows what they don't know, right? I mean, you might need a business valuation. You might need an estate attorney that understands trust. And then you just mentioned the real estate professional, mortgage professional. So we have to coordinate with people all the time to help.
But that's a really important point. I'm glad you raised it, which is, what you don't know, and what other professionals might need to be brought into the process, and you can make those connections when necessary. Or you might have another person in your firm who could do it. Right? Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the beauty of, having the financial person, though, is as a coordinating person as well. Like you can maybe you're giving referrals, you're trying to help them understand the information that they're hearing. You're keeping sort of a container on the process of how they're doing, how they're getting that information. It doesn't get kind of unwieldy. And also there's, people hear the wrong things, or they hear what they want to hear. So.
Yeah. And I know you have the experience of working with a couple where somebody has been the money manager and somebody doesn't understand finances, doesn't really know what their finances look like, really has a learning curve, and you're going to work with those people, to even out the playing field a bit.
No, absolutely. And it's also helpful, I will say, to the person that does know all the finances, because they need their spouse to be brought up to speed in order to get a settlement. They need that person to understand that they're getting information that's neutral, that's unbiased, that's, an advisor to them. And I think that's always helping the other side as well.
Debbie, I know that there are times when a financial professional can go to court to testify for one party in a divorce. Can you talk about some of the situations in which that might happen?
Absolutely. So if a couple is going to end up in court, very typically they're talking about what is the actual income that someone has. Some people may have earnings that are coming in commissions and bonuses, or in different ways than your normal W-2. And so there needs to be an explanation about the ability to pay support, for example, and what is their income. Or it might be that somebody is debating a budget, like somebody's expressing their expenses that the other party does not feel is reasonable. And so there might be testimony about that. The other part might be forensics, which I'll say is really where we're trying to trace some money that somebody may have spent outside the marriage. They may have spent money on an affair. They may have transferred money to other accounts. We may have to go back a few years and try to find the money, find where the money went, or identify certain expenses that may not have been, for the couple themselves. So we typically call that dissipation, but where money has, left the family, and that needs to be somewhat of a calculation. And then the third part would be a business valuation. I'd say very commonly, if anyone has a business, even a sole proprietor, somebody that has a closely held business, or maybe even a law firm, like where somebody is a lawyer and part of a partnership, and what is the value of that? And there's some very sophisticated ways to calculate that. And there's a range. There's typically a range.
Debbie, I think one of the things that some of our listeners are going to have questions about is this matter of marital and non-marital money and assets. And I'm imagining that questions related to marital, non-marital issues are some of the things that might bring a financial professional to court. Can you say a little about that?
Absolutely. And that is pretty common, that people owned a house prior to the marriage, and then that got rolled into another house, and they're wondering, why is it all marital when I put some money into the house before we were married? Or very commonly, they had their 401k or their IRA. They worked somewhere prior to the marriage, and they were accumulating funds prior to the marriage. It's non-marital, presumably. Or they get a gift. They get a gift from their parents. They get an inheritance. And people, because they're married, they put the money wherever they put it. It sometimes is commingled, as we would say, with other assets. And there needs to be a way to maybe at least put out there what the calculations might have looked like if we could have separated those. So that is another area that people spend a lot of time on.
Sure. And it gets there's so many factors. It can get very murky, right? Because somebody might claim that the house was bought with pre-marital assets, in other words, money that they had before they came to the marriage, but the other person put in a lot of sweat equity, fixing it up, or stayed home with children, but that's like an in-kind contribution. So things get pretty complex.
No, absolutely. It does get very murky. And that's where you're trying to make your argument, you're trying to make your position be what you think it should be from an equitable standpoint.
So while some of those issues are going to be legal,
yeah,
right? Because there is law on this, but like a lot of things related to family law, I think that the law is not complicated, but the application of it can be very quirky. But your role isn't really as a lawyer; it's to say, this is what we can trace, this is what we can't trace, and these are some other factors, right? Things to think about. Is that what you?
No, absolutely. On the financial side, we will be doing this in a lot of processes to give people at least a range of what they're looking at that might have been non-marital, that might have been marital, and how to think about it. Because sometimes people might have put money in the 401k pre-marriage 20 years ago.
Right.
And 20 years ago is a different valuation than it might be now. So you're trying to give people an idea of what they're looking at financially. And the law plays a huge part state by state and how that would be looked at in court. But that's really the lawyering part of it. Sometimes we're just asked to give ranges and make projections so that people can help settle.
What about at the other end? When the agreement is penned?
Well, I think, I tell people, like, you sign your agreement, that's kind of the end, and now we have a new beginning. So people want to know what they need to know to implement everything. So step one is to make sure they understand the agreement, that they know how to transfer their accounts, they know how to get on their health insurance, they know how to do all these things that they literally have signed an agreement about, but they just haven't actually done it, if you will. And then we're available. I mean, in most processes, we're available to still continue to help with the tax work, help with the financial planning, or if they need investment management. Obviously, it's not mandatory, but some people do want to continue and try to get help that way. But at the very, very least, we want to go through and make sure that they've been able to implement their agreement. Because I've had people that have come back 2 years later and they haven't changed their beneficiaries on their IRAs.
Sure.
They still have their spouse. There's things like that we know, and they're not difficult, but there's a lot of laundry list of things they need to know.
Well, Debbie, I really want to thank you for coming on the podcast. I think you have so much to add to the conversation about separation and divorce. Just the fact that you understand that divorce is, it's a financial process, it's a legal process, but it's really first and foremost an emotional process. And you're not the mental health person on their team, but you are psychologically minded in the work that you do, in addition to this great breadth and depth of understanding. So I think that people are going to be really a little surprised and very interested and happy to know that you and people like you exist. So thanks again.
All right. Thank you very much, Kate. I appreciate being here.
Thanks for listening to Divorce on Planet Earth. If you'd like a heads up about new episodes, I invite you to follow the show. You can do that on Apple Podcasts or pretty much any other major podcast platform, or on your social of choice. On Instagram, I am Kate_Scharf. On X, I am @Kate_Scharf. And on Facebook, I am Kate Scharf, MSW. That's M like Mary, S like sunshine, W like whatever. You'll also find my blog, Relationships on Planet Earth, and other information about me and my work at katescharf.com. I hope what you've heard here has been helpful, but since everyone's situation is different, the content is not intended as a substitute for clinical advice or recommendations. Talk to you next time.